Hello and welcome back to another little Piskie Bite, mini episodes where we explore some of the folklore, history and legends from across Devon and Cornwall. First of all, a big thank you to everyone who's been listening so far, to all the amazing patrons, and for those of you who've sent in your lovely messages and feedback as well. If you're enjoying the series and you'd like to support the project further, there's a few ways you can help by simply spreading the word among your friends, giving us a like and subscribe, maybe even leaving us a review. All of that really helps to expand this project and reach out further. And if you like, you can also check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/The Piskie Trap. Right, that's enough of that. Let's crack on. A while back now, I chatted with the brilliant Anna Chalton of May's Tales for the episode talking about piskies. And recently I was thinking, this is the Piskie Trap after all. It's high time that we delved back into the world of the Pobl Veen or the Little People. So I thought we'd take a look at some examples that we haven't touched on before, exploring some Piskie beliefs and superstitions. In their book, Folklore of Cornwall, Tony Dean and Tony Shaw write, in 1965, a lady who had spent much of her life on Bodmin Moor around Warlegan told us that even then there were a number of elderly people who would avoid the moors at night for fear of being piskie-led by dancing lights. So even in the mid-20th century, there were pockets of people who still held on to these local superstitions. Going back a bit further to the 18th and 19th centuries, there were many tales of piskies and their mischievous nature. Many of them collected by the likes of William Bottrell, Robert Hunt, as well as Ennis Tregarthen and Thomas Quiller Couch, among others. In the far west of Cornwall, there seems to have been strong beliefs and superstitions regarding what I suppose you'd call changelings. Henry Madden, interviewed by Walter Evans Vence in the early 1900s, stated, "The country pixies inhabiting the highlands from above Newlyn on to St. Just were considered a wicked sort. Their great ambition was to change their own offspring for human children, and the true child could only be got back by laying a four-leaf clover on the changeling." You do get the sense that this may have been a genuine fear at one time. Dean and Shaw write, and I quote, "It was customary, as already mentioned, for a christening party to carry some cake to church and give it to the first person met on the road. This practice protected the child against both witchcraft and the power of the piskies. In many a cottage home, the baby's nightgown would be pinned to its cot overnight to prevent the piskies from stealing the child and substituting one of their own offspring." Another writer and folklorist, Margaret Ann Courtney, who we've talked about a few times in the past, writes, "If piskies are kind and helpful little beings, spriggans or sprites are spiteful creatures, never doing a good turn for anyone. It is they who carry off poor babies from their mothers when they've been obliged to leave them for a few hours alone, putting their own ugly, peevish brats in their cradles, who never thrive under the foster mother's care, in spite of all the trouble they may bestow upon them." She goes on to retell a condensed version of a tale passed down by Bottrell involving a changeling. I should say at the outset that this story, as with a number of tales and accounts like it, involves some pretty dark superstitions and practices when it comes to how the afflicted child or changeling is treated. So just a bit of a heads up there. The tale is set near Chapel Carn Bray, on the road between Penzance and St Just, and surrounds a woman named Jenny Trayer, and I quote, "The mother, Jenny Trayer by name, was first alarmed on her return one night from her work in the harvest field by not finding her child in its cradle, but in a corner of the kitchen, where in olden days the wood and furs for the then general open fires were kept. She was, however, too tired to take much notice, and went to bed, and slept soundly until the morning. From that time forth she had no peace. The child was never satisfied but when eating or drinking, or when she had it dandling in her arms. The poor woman consulted her neighbours in turn as to what she should do with the changeling, as one and all agreed it was. One recommended her to dip it on the 3 first Wednesdays in May in Chapel Uni Well, which advice was twice faithfully carried out in the prescribed manner. The 3rd Wednesday was very wet and windy, but Jenny, determined to persevere in this treatment of her ugly bantling, and holding the brat, who seemed to enjoy the storm, firmly on her shoulders, she trudged off. When they got about halfway, a shrill voice from behind some rocks was heard to say,
Tredrill, Tredrill, thy wife and children greet thee well.
Not seeing anyone, the woman was of course alarmed, and her fright increased when the imp made answer in a similar voice.
What care I for wife or child, when I ride on Dowdy's back to Chapel Well, and have got Pat my fill?
After this adventure, she took the advice of another neighbour, who told her the best way to get rid of the spriggan and have her own child returned was to put the small body upon the ashes pile and beat it well with a broom, then lay it naked under a church stile. There leave it, and keep out of sight and hearing till the turn of night, when, 9 times out of 10, the thing will be taken away and the stolen child returned. This was finally done. All the women of the village after it had been put upon a convenient pile, belabouring it with their brooms, upon which it naturally set up a frightful roar. After dark it was laid under the stile, and there next morning the woman found her own dear child sleeping on some dry straw, most beautifully clean and wrapped in a piece of chintz. Jenny nursed her recovered child with great care, but there was always something queer about it, as there always is about one that has been in the fairies' power, if only for a few days. A fascinating story that's, well, it's pretty out there, but it definitely gives us some insight into the peculiar customs and superstitions surrounding the idea of changelings. And they may seem pretty wild and weird to us in the 21st century, but you do get a sense that there was a real fear and superstition about changelings that seems to have existed within Cornish communities a couple of centuries back anyway. As an example, Dean and Shaw draw our attention to an article in the West Briton in 1843, in which a man named Trevelyan of Penzance was charged with cruelty and mistreatment of his son. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail, as, frankly, it makes for pretty bleak reading. But in short, the boy's parents believed him to be a changeling, and that their own child had been stolen by the Piskies. The case was thrown out for lack of evidence, but nonetheless, Trevelyan was basically run out of Penzance. I think that speaks to a level of belief and superstition that continued even as relatively recently as the 19th century, despite Victorian scholars and high society often looking down on these kinds of local superstitions. I want to take a closer look now at this species or category of little folk, the Spriggans, sometimes pronounced Spridgeons. They were said to act as guardians of the ancient sites, particularly in West Cornwall. They were said to be grotesque, and many believed them to be the ghosts of giants, and that they could change shape and form. Dean and Shaw write, and I quote, "Another tale involves a troop of Spriggan soldiers in the fairy revels on the Gump near St Just in Penwith. They were guarding a fairy fold, and dealt with a human intruder by pinning his hair to the ground with magical cobwebs. As an additional punishment, a small Spriggan jumped on his nose until, laughing, it shouted, 'Away, away, I smell the day,' and ran off. At daybreak, the man was able to shake himself free and return home." End quote. Margaret Ann Courtney writes, "Spriggans, too, guard the vast treasures that are supposed to be buried beneath our immense cairns and in our cliff castles. No matter if the work be carried on by night or by day, they are sure to punish the rash person who ventures to dig in hopes of securing them. When he has got some way down, he finds himself surrounded by hundreds of ugly beings, in some cases almost as tall as he, who scare the unhappy man until he loses all control of himself, throws down his tools, and rushes off as fast as he can possibly go. The fright often makes him so ill that he has to lie for days in bed. Should he ever summon up courage to return to the spot, he will find the pit refilled, and no traces to show that the ground had been disturbed." So, a few tales and local superstitions then surrounding the idea of changelings and Spriggans, or Spridgeons if you will. I just want to take a quick look now at a couple of other little Piskie superstitions I've recently discovered and that stood out to me. One I found in Cornish Feasts and Folklore reads, and I quote, "It was once a common custom in East Cornwall, when houses were built, to leave holes in the walls by which the little beings could enter. To stop them up would drive away good luck." And in West Cornwall, knobs of lead known as Piskie's paws or Piskie feet were placed at intervals on the roofs of farmhouses to prevent the Piskies from dancing on them and turning the milk sour in the dairies. Country people in East Cornwall sometimes put a prayer book under a child's pillow as a charm to keep away Piskies. End quote. And this last bit fits in with something in Thomas Quiller Couch's Notes and Queries of 1850, where he writes, "I am told that a poor woman near Launceston was fully persuaded that one of her children was taken away and a Piskie substituted, the disaster being caused by the absence of a prayer book on one particular night." So there you go, just a few examples of some of the local beliefs and superstitions relating to Piskies and fairy folk from Cornwall. I hope you've enjoyed this little Piskie bite. We'll be back again very soon with another full-length episode. Thanks for listening.